When it comes to different types of animals, we often find that representing their textural qualities and their unique features can be quite tricky. And perhaps one of the most unique and interesting textural qualities to represent is that of snake skin scales. With that being said, snake skin scales is a very specific type of pattern, and in today's tutorial we will be going through a few simple steps, breaking down an easy guide on how to draw and represent snake skin in a realistic way. So with that being said, hey guys, my name is Matt. Welcome to another video by artincontext.org, where we explore various art related topics, and in today's video we will be breaking down the process of how to draw scales, specifically snake skin scales. Now, to have the best chance of representing this as accurate as possible within the drawing format, there are some fundamental concepts one needs to understand about snake skin scale pattern. Now, there are three main things to understand. The first is the pattern, where you basically establish the grid, and this is where you allow the grid to kind of demarcate the areas in which you integrate the pattern of scales. The next thing is wrapping, where you start to think about the structure as a three-dimensional concept or a shape in terms of how these scales actually wrap around this cylindrical shape, which tends to be that of the snake structure, quite cylindrical in shape. And then the last thing is shading. However, all these concepts are kind of looked at in detail on our website, so you can go to artincontext.org. A link will be provided below. But now we're going to apply these concepts to a drawing. So now that we have a working knowledge of the different concepts and how to progress through the drawing process, we want to see how we can utilize these concepts within a simple cylindrical snake structure. Now, the first thing we want to do is basically sketch the shape of the snake and basically establish the pattern grid. So we start by drawing a curved cylindrical shape, almost like an arced structure, and this will also help us provide a kind of unique form of this cylindrical shape, where we kind of have this twisting action. From there, we basically want to start drawing curved lines into that twisting body shape. So remember that when we add lines, the crisscross of that grid structure, we can also add slight curvature to them, and this will also make us kind of think about how the snake's body is capable of twisting. So we really want to capture that twisting quality within our grid as well. Now, adding a grid to a twisting structure is also a good way to learn about the distortions within the different scales, especially from the perspective at which we are viewing this particular structure. So naturally, some scales will seem slightly distorted, and that is just because they are twisting around the body. Now, when you start on one side and kind of move your way through, you will find that the lines will naturally curve just by drawing parallel lines alongside each other. Now, we can also continue this process of drawing a twisting grid that flows along the cylindrical structure until the grid twists around the structure and is out of sight. Again, you really want to consider the actual three-dimensional cylindrical nature of the actual snake and how it has this twisting motion, and therefore some of the scales will eventually move out of sight. So we can also draw simple lines to establish a underbelly as well, in terms of kind of contextualizing the feature of our twisting snake body. So we don't necessarily need to draw scales along the entire cylindrical shape, but having this underbelly section also again contextualizes the way in which we understand how the scales kind of move along the back structure of our snake cylindrical structure. Now, the next thing we're going to do is actually draw the scales into the grid. So as the fundamental concepts describe the application process of scales, we can now add our scales to our twisting structure. Again, the grid makes the adding of the scales much easier, so the idea is to definitely use the actual grid to assist you in incorporating your scales into each block. Now, naturally, because the structure is twisting, the scales will have slight differences in size, once again due to the distortion as it twists, but this distortion is okay, and in many ways it does add kind of a more realistic quality of how the scales kind of move and twist and kind of expand as the snake twists, or the whole body of the snake twists. So it is okay if there are these subtle distortions, and in many ways it's just a great visual addition to your actual drawing. We also want to make sure that as we continue with this process row by row, we want to think about it as if we are stacking bricks. So the intention is to definitely go row by row, and this way you are less likely to make a mistake, making sure you're sticking to the grid as a way to demarcate the areas in which you incorporate your scales. So we do want to make sure that we continue this process really slowly, being patient, being very cautious of how we build up these scales, using the grid to kind of help us and assist us in where they should be placed. Now, as you start to draw the scales along the twisting grid, you will find that the scales again start to get slightly more narrow and narrower due to the way in which the grid starts to get more narrow near the edges, where the grid starts to basically twist out of sight. And once again, with a more organic structure structure like this, where we're dealing with snake skin, there will be subtle expansions within the scales and slight scale differences. A better word to use is size differences in the scales, just due to how the snake's body actually has this ability to expand and contract. So having the subtle distortion in scale sizes is completely okay, but otherwise the intention is to basically slowly work your little spear-headed shapes into all of these little demarcated diamond-like shapes established by your grid, and slowly work through the entire grid of your snake scale drawing. Now once you have done that, we're going to basically move on to shading the scale. So we want to really think again about a light source being kind of present predominantly on one side, and this just helps us to establish a more realistic shadow representation within our snake scale drawing. So let's start by establishing a lighter layer of shading with our pencils first, where we work little gradients within each scale one at a time. With the shading process, it does take time. However, if you do spend time on it, it's going to have a more realistic result at the end. So as we shade in each scale, we also want to make sure that we are leaving the little negative spaces or edging around each scale. So this will help to also establish a distinction between the scales, and it also functions as a highlight that emphasizes the three-dimensional quality of each little scale. So it is kind of a time-consuming process, but again, the intention is to kind of make a more realistic representation of scales, and in order to do so, paying attention to subtle detailing like this is really important. So the idea is that we basically want to shade in each little scale, starting at the bottom of each scale and creating this little gradient that gets lighter and lighter, ultimately leaving a negative edging or kind of trim around the top of each scale, and that creates a distinction between the next scale that we begin to shade, again with the same process in mind. Now make sure you are conscious of which direction the light source is coming from. In this way we have a more accurate kind of way of understanding which side the shadows should be most prominent. So naturally, if the light source is coming from the left, we basically want to integrate some shading or darker shading along the right side of the snake, because that side is less exposed to the light source. Now once we have established this lighter layer of pencil sketching, we can start to darken or build up these darker tonal values with a darker medium. In this case we will be working with pen. We are working with some simple tools because this is quite a traditional drawing method. However, the process and the concepts apply to all drawing styles or mediums, whether you are working with a digital medium or painting. The idea of building up your tonal values from lighter to darker is the same. Now we always want to basically work from the darker side towards the lighter side, and this way we can also have a lot more control over the gradients from dark to light within our snake scale drawing. However, there are two ways to establish a gradient within a snake skin drawing. So one is that we can darken the scales one at a time, again making sure that each scale gets slightly lighter as we shift towards the illuminated or lighter side of our snake kind of cylindrical structure as a twist towards the light source. But then another way to do it is you can actually shade over the entire scale drawing itself, basically shading over all of them, moving from the darker side to the lighter side. Preferably working with both these methods is ideal, where you basically focus on establishing some shading in each scale, in each individual scale, and then slowly going over it, slowly going over all those scales with some just general shading over the entire scale structure is just a great way to really enhance that shadow quality and therefore the three-dimensional nature, and then making it more realistic within your snake drawing. Now by working on individual scales, we can be a little bit more cautious about how the gradients will kind of flow from dark to lighter areas within the snake scale drawing, but again we can also use the scales as rows that can slightly lighten as they get nearer to the actual light source. So the process does take longer when you're working on individual scales, but it is completely worth it when you take your time and pay attention to each scale. By taking your time, you will have a higher quality result once you have completed the entire shading process. But it is completely up to you in terms of what you are trying to achieve aesthetically. If you are looking for something more realistic, paying attention to each scale is really important. We will find that also as we come back to the little shaded scales to darken them a little more if need be, the process is all about layering and patiently allowing the gradient in the structure to unfold. So you do want to think think about it as a layering process when it comes to shading, because the idea is to build up from lighter tonal values to darker tonal values, working your way from one side of your snake structure to the other side. And that's where you basically work from the darker side or the shadowed side to the exposed side or the illuminated side. Now, you do just want to make sure you're being patient with your shading process, and basically representing scales in a realistic way should take time, so we shouldn't be surprised at that. So snake skin drawing will take some time, but the more attention you give it, the more realistic the drawing will be. So as long as you are intentional about which side the light source is present, you can then be a little bit more aware of which areas of the structure need to be darker. But other than a little patience, that is how you draw snake skin scale patterns. You can also do one last complete shading over the entire structure once you have added shading to the individual scales. Once again, that's just an additional way to emphasize the three-dimensional quality of the entire snake skin scale patterns. But otherwise, guys, that is it on how to draw realistic scales, specifically more snake skin type pattern. Some key things to think about is, again, think about the general pattern that you want to establish, which is kind of more spearheaded when it comes to snake skin shapes. From there, you do want to think about integrating the grid. You also want to think about the three-dimensional cylindrical nature of the actual snake structure, where basically that grid will have the wrapping effect around that cylindrical structure, and therefore some scales will become slightly distorted as they wrap out of view. And then the last thing you want to think about is how to integrate shading to emphasize the three-dimensional qualities and the more realistic representation of how light and shadow kind of function or interact with this unique type of textural quality, which is a snake skin scale. But otherwise, guys, I hope this video was helpful. If you did like it, please let us know by liking the video and subscribing. This helps us to grow the channel, which ultimately enables us to make more fun art related content for you guys. If you are also interested in similar related topics, please let us know in the comment section below. Maybe we can look at other unique kind of textural qualities associated with animals like feathers, fur, but it's completely up to you. But otherwise, do just let us know in the comment section below and we will attend to it. But otherwise, guys, thanks again for tuning in. That is it from me today. Until next time, cheers.